Hey everybody, so I decided to make this video because I recently became quite interested in small or little known wars in American history. So today I'll talk about the First Barbary War, a time that the United States went to war against Islamic pirates in North Africa. I'm willing to guess that that's not a familiar conflict to most of you, so let's get into it and hopefully you guys find it interesting. I'm willing to guess that when most people think of American involvement in the Islamic world, they typically think of pretty recent events. Maybe the 2003 invasion of Iraq, or the still ongoing war in Afghanistan, for example. It may come as a surprise then that the United States involvement goes back much further. We actually fought two wars in North Africa over 200 years ago. Those would be the First and Second Barbary Wars, two conflicts that the United States fought against the so-called Barbary coast states of Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and Morocco. For hundreds of years, these countries had used officially sanctioned pirates to attack and raid European trading vessels in order to plunder their goods and to take their crews as slaves. In exchange for money and treasures, however, they would grant merchants from a country safe passage through the Mediterranean. European nations had long ago realized it was far cheaper for them to just pay the fee, and that way they could keep their lucrative trade in the Mediterranean going safely. American trade vessels, because they were technically subjects of the British Crown, were under protection of treaties that England and the pirates had made long ago. But that all changed when the American Revolution happened, and suddenly they no longer had the protection of the Royal Navy, and none of the treaties that England had with the pirates applied anymore. So pretty soon after declaring independence in 1776, America started to have issues with Barbary pirates and their ships came under attack. And they had their first run-in March 1783, so not that long after the Revolution, American shipping vessels ended up having a run-in with Barbary pirates, but they were able to escape to Spanish-protected waters. On October 11th, 1784, Moroccan pirates seized American brig Betsy and their crew became hostages, and the news reached the US in February 1785. Keep in mind too that during this time, crossing the Atlantic Ocean was no small feat, and it took many months, and so a lot of news and information in this story takes a long time to get back and forth across the ocean. It was one of the big complications of this conflict. So there was a fairly long period between 1783 and 1790 where not much was done about the Barbary issue, just because there was so much other very important stuff going on in American history at that moment. The most important of this for sure being in 1787, the Federal Convention, where the Constitution, the Bill of Rights were drafted and adopted in 1788. And in 1789, George Washington was elected as the first president of the United States. And finally, 1790, Barbary matters were taken up again as urgent matters of state. So during this period of inaction, a lot had happened. A lot of American trading vessels had been attacked, and there was even an ongoing hostage crisis at this moment. So understandably, a lot of Americans were quite upset about the whole issue. So finally, on March 10th, 1794, after much debate, the US Navy was formed. And this is not actually considered by the Navy to be its founding date, but it is the founding date of the nation's first permanent naval force, which is why I consider this conflict to be so significant and interesting. Because in a very real sense, this conflict created the US Navy. It was the existential threat to the United States that gave us a reason to create our first permanent naval force that exists even during peacetime. It should be noted that the US Navy claims October 13th, 1775 as its founding date because that's when the Continental Navy was made during the Revolutionary War. But after the Revolutionary War finished, that Navy actually disbanded. And we didn't have a Navy until 1794 when we formed it again to deal with this threat. So anybody who served in the US Navy has this war to thank for the branch that they served in. So finally, after so much delay, on June 2nd, 1801, a squadron of American ships disembarked from Virginia, officially with a peaceful mission, but in reality, their goal was to go to North Africa and provoke a war with the North African states. Originally, the squadron was led by this guy, Richard Dale, who spent about a year in the North African waters without much success, so he ended up being replaced by a new commander, Richard Morris, who was unfortunately far worse than he was. a very poor naval commander who ended up just kind of messing around in Gibraltar for a long time. He was very cautious, and he basically did nothing the entire time that he was there. He spent all of his time having fancy dinners in Gibraltar, doing nothing. And finally, after a while of this going on, American commanders realized what was going on. They recalled him to America and severely reprimanded him as a result. Another disaster that occurred during this war was the capture of the USS Philadelphia, which was the United States' biggest and most powerful ship in the squadron. It ran aground, and Tripoli soldiers were able to capture it. So what ended up happening is that some US soldiers had to sneak aboard and set fire to the ship and quietly sail away before they could be shot at or captured. And that ended up being one of the most legendary moments in US naval history, actually, and it's been immortalized in this extremely famous painting. Finally, after years of a somewhat unsuccessful blockade, the United States actually attempted a land invasion of Tripoli, and General Eaton gathered his forces in Alexandria, Egypt, as well as hundreds of mercenaries, marched across the desert to a city in Tripoli, and was actually successful in his attack. And this was the first time ever that the United States flag was raised on enemy soil, and it certainly wouldn't be the last, but it's quite the moment in American history, in a conflict that most people don't know anything about. Ultimately, capturing that city was a turning point in the war. It allowed America to get the hostages back, and it caused a lot of the Barbary states to lose interest in fighting the United States and made them realize it wasn't worth it anymore. And the conflict petered out after that. Overall, the First Barbary War was a very messy affair. It didn't necessarily make the United States look that great on the world stage, but it did end up forming the United States Navy and was its first test in overseas waters. And it was kind of a prophetic moment of what was to come with the United States, ending up being a prominent naval power in the world today.